What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Dispatch. A fun spin on a classic superhero tale in the form of a narrative title. But before we dive fully into this, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below that covers everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though, in the case of this game, a couple extra things I need to mention. For starters, I did receive a review key for this. However, the game also received an episodic release. This means that of its 8 chapters, a couple of them released like every week since its initial release, and that finally wrapped up on November 12th, which is why it took so long to get this out, as I did not have access to those later chapters initially, and had to wait until they launched just like everybody else. On top of that, I also wanted to mention that I think one of the achievements is bugged, which is then also preventing the completion achievement. There's an achievement for like succeeding at all the hacking levels. I have been extremely thorough, even finding a couple that only pop up in certain circumstances, and I'm not having any luck getting that to work. So it's either bugged or I'm missing something. Could honestly go either way, but I'm just not inclined to hold up a review over something so trivial. So here we are. Especially since I was able to confirm that at least a lot of other people have a similar issue, or at the very least seem to be missing something. But either way, let's go ahead and dive fully into the rest of this. But do be aware of spoilers. This is a big narrative game. The story is the game. To that end, I'm not going to be showing any footage from the last couple of episodes, and then even with that restriction, there's stuff in the footage that I think could be a contextual spoiler for somebody, and so you may either just want to listen or skip past the story section or do whatever you gotta do, but, be aware, I suppose. Now, let's talk a bit about the game itself. So, as I mentioned, this is a narrative title. The vast majority of this game is cutscenes that you can choose to either interact with via QTEs or just turn those off and have a more cinematic experience, and then just have to deal with the relatively simple gameplay sections that see you managing heroes on dispatch calls. Like many a narrative game, it's not particularly long. The individual chapters, of which there are 8, take, I would say, 30 to 45 minutes apiece. And while there are a bunch of decisions that you can make back and forth, you can actually copy your own save file into other save file slots, which will let you easily traverse previous moments in the story, which is how you can check up on what decision does what without having to replay the whole thing. But broad strokes, I would say Dispatch is a story that I enjoyed a lot. I think it does a great job adding characterization to all of the individuals you meet. And while on the gameplay side of things, it is pretty minimalistic, what they do have here, they at least tried to implement in a way that felt involved in terms of what's going on, meaning for instance, Robert can do some hacking while you are on these dispatch calls, which sees him a little more directly involved, and there are consequences to passing or failing a lot of those, even if they are relatively minor at times. Now, as a choice and consequence-based narrative title, some of that is a little hit or miss. On one hand, there are several decisions and choices you'll make that have a large impact on the game's various endings and outcomes and stuff, and then there's a lot of decisions that seem important but don't really lead anywhere or have much of a difference at all. And so, while I enjoyed this game, honestly, it's the kind of enjoyment I would get more from a TV show than a video game. It's very good, but it almost reminds me more of those old interactive TV shows they tried to do at one point, rather than something that feels good in the medium of a video game. Either way though, let's keep it moving to the technical section. So on the technical side of things, for the most part, the game runs pretty well. It is fairly simple. However, there are a variety of different problems that have popped up. Some have been fixed as they did the episodic releases. Like, for instance, there were some soft locks in episode 6 based on some decisions you might make. And I've also seen some people have reports of the actual dispatch gameplay sections just never resolving on their own, that kind of thing. So it's certainly not free from bugs, but it's also not unplayable or anything. I think for the most part it's fine. And given the nature of the game, it's not exactly a demanding title, so it runs on extremely little. But let's keep it moving. Next up, I wanted to mention a couple of the accessibility options. This is not a game with difficulty really, but there are a couple accessibility related things. For instance, the QTEs for the cutscenes, you can just turn those off. There's also nudity in the game that you can turn off or on. So there is some stuff like that you can adjust. But otherwise, let's go ahead and dive into the bulk of this, which is the story setup and my thoughts on it. So again, as a story related game, the story kind of is the game here, and thus spoilers are pretty much a given, though I'm not going to be going into every little detail. Dispatch primarily puts us in the role of Robert Robertson, the latest in a line of heroes who take the form of Mecha Man. In particular, he has a giant robotic suit that allowed him to suit up and fight crime, which is how he spent most of his life until that suit was destroyed by his arch-nemesis Shroud. Shroud is a villain who killed his father, the previous Mecha Man, and so at the very beginning of the game when this happens, we meet Robert here while he is going through a bit of a crisis, given how he no longer has the ability to repair the suit, he's out of money, and is basically forced to quit being a hero. Now, in the midst of all that, you are offered a lifeline via a woman known as Blonde Blazer, primarily. A superhero that runs SDN, a dispatch network where they put heroes to work by responding to various dispatch calls. Basically, as an offer of employment, they're going to help you get your suit back up and running if you help them with a sort of experimental program they're running over at the dispatch network, which is to say, they want you to at least attempt to rehabilitate some of their villains in the Phoenix program. You see, SDN has been trying to redeem some supervillains and give them an opportunity to earn a pardon, basically, by performing the task of heroes, and that program has not been going particularly well. They want to bring you in to, hopefully get it on the right track. Your job in that, given that you don't have your suit anymore, is to play the role of dispatcher, taking on these teams of superheroes and assigning them to appropriate calls, and generally just managing them as a team, both in the dispatcher little minigame, but also in the decisions you'll be making throughout the story. Unsurprisingly, all of that eventually ties together and incorporates Shroud and the people you meet along the way, like Chase, who's been a sort of mentor of yours throughout the years, who you haven't seen much since your father died, and as somebody with super speed, you find out that using his powers was slowly aging him, and so now at the ripe old age of 40, he looks like an 80-year-old man. And overall, I would say there's a lot of fun twists on that, just in terms of powers and characters all along the way. So what strikes me generally about the story here, though, is just how good of a job they do at presenting all of these different characters in meaningful ways over what is, honestly, a relatively short runtime. A great deal of that is the individual conversations and cutscenes and choices, sure, but there's also actually the gameplay side of it, and where I think they make the most use of this being a video game, in the sense that as you dispatch heroes in that minigame, you will see little moments reflected, like for instance, they may just straight up refuse a job or insert themselves into situations or have various effects sort of hoisted onto them because of everything that's happening outside of the actual work on the shift they're doing. And that, combined with the hacking and stuff, is probably the most involved you're going to feel in terms of, what this does as a video game. Now, along the way, as I mentioned, there are a few big choices that have big outcomes both on the actual gameplay and the story itself and the ending. This is like, which character do you romance? Blonde Blazer or Invisigal? At one point, there's an opportunity to cut one of the members from the team, a choice of one or the other. That then leads into an opportunity to recruit a different hero, again a binary choice between one or another, and that's going to affect the dispatch minigame quite a bit because those heroes have synergies and stuff potentially. And for the most part, I think they did fine with this, though I did notice there are a few situations where it does kind of feel like there's a canon or expected choice, as the differing cutscenes in the case that you don't pick that thing don't always make a ton of sense. But basically, managing all that leads to the game's main outcomes, the state of the city once all's said and done. And overall, it's a pretty compelling story, though at least for me personally, while I enjoyed the ending well enough, don't get me wrong, I do think comparatively, everything leading up to that moment, it does drop the ball a tiny bit, because with as minimal spoilers as possible, they try to do this triple agent thing that I don't think really makes any sense, even in the context of that scene, unless you assume several people are just lying the whole time. It's just way too easy to poke holes in that specific scenario, and I don't really like how they tried to do that. In order for that to make sense, you have to make just a ton of assumptions which are not directly presented to you, And it just feels like a lot of mental gymnastics trying to make sense of that, and it seems like it could have been handled better, frankly. Otherwise, it was a really enjoyable time. I thought it was a great story. It obviously has big themes of things like redemption, with the villains trying to find that exact redemption, even Robert trying to figure out who he is without his suit, and a lot of other, of course, side stories along the way with the individual villains themselves, of course. So if that's the kind of thing that speaks to you, I think it is great. Next up, though, let's talk about the actual sort of gameplay side of things, what little bit there is. Now, there are, of course, the choices you can make, which are interactive, yes, but the main form of gameplay comes in the actual dispatch minigame. You'll have the heroes that are actually available to dispatch on the various calls that will come in. These are naturally on a timer, so you have to be quick about it, and that comes into play because after a call, these characters have to return to their home base, which is based on like their own movement abilities and stuff. Some of them can fly potentially, that kind of thing, and then once they get back to the base, they have to rest for a little while. So time is absolutely a factor here, and probably unsurprisingly, there are in fact perfect heroes for the job, which can help greatly in getting something done if you can figure that out. Now, as they perform these calls, hopefully successfully, they can then potentially increase their stats to give them more chance at successfully resolving these calls in the future. So basically, you just have to look at each call individually, pay attention to what it is actually asking you for, and then, make a decision about what hero to send as a result. You can replay these once you know kind of what's going on to do as well as possible, but it's not like an insanely difficult thing to figure out or anything. It's relatively on the simple side. However, there are a few other factors to it as well. Each individual hero has like powers and abilities and quirks to them, kind of with how their powers work. This can give you bonuses or detriments when you send those individual heroes on a particular mission. They also have potentially synergies with each other. For instance, Malevola and Phenomenon do well if sent on missions together, that kind of thing. And doing that more and more basically makes them more effective as a team if you want to lean into it. And then to add on to things a little bit farther, in the middle of these dispatch sessions, it's also potentially possible to send some of these heroes to training if you can find the time for it. This will actually allow them to learn extra abilities and expand on what they already do to, again, do better and better as you go. Which handles, I would say, basically everything in terms of like the main gameplay and progression. However, there is a little bit extra in the form of the hacking minigames. Some calls you don't need to send a hero for because Robert, our tech expert here, let's say, is capable of hacking things, and sometimes you can hack into systems, which has its own separate little minigame, which expands and changes over the episodes, but the gist of it is basically interact with some form of electronics to make you feel more involved in the story, of course. Beyond that stuff, failing calls or things like that can get individual heroes injured or potentially even downed if it happens twice. And that's where doing well can potentially save you. So it is possible to heal these injuries, which come with reduced stats, like sending Malevola out with somebody can help with that as an example. But also, when you do well on an individual shift, you'll get potentially bonus rewards and stuff. And some of those rewards are like single-use items that will help you out in those situations, like one will just restore a downed character as an example. But that is pretty much it. So that brings us to the Steam Deck section. This game is verified on the Steam Deck. I don't know if you could tell by just looking at it up to this point, but it's not a particularly complicated game, and thus it suits something like a handheld thing very, very well. It has controller support, cloud saves, of course, stuff like that, so it should be very easy to play it over there. So if you just needed confirmation, yes, it works. Which brings us to positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side, loved the story. That's probably the most important thing you can ask for as a narrative title. I think all of the characters were really well done. And while there are certainly one or two questionable moments, things I would have preferred to go a different way, that kind of stuff, by and large, I had a great time with it. And it's primarily down to how these characters are written and presented. But on the negative side, I guess for me it just really comes down to the fact that there's not much actual gameplay here. And as I mentioned at the top of the video, it really feels more like one of those interactive TV shows than a proper video game in many respects. And I mean, even something like adding an endless mode version of the dispatch mini game would probably make it feel a little more like a game in the sense that it makes use of the medium. And I guess the easy way to put it is just that there is very little gameplay in this video game, which brings me to my conclusion. Dispatch is $30 US for the whole thing. And for that price, on one hand, I think you are getting a mostly really great story with really great characters and a fun enough little minigame for what it is. And in that way, I would recommend it. I would just add a sort of addendum to that, being that I liked this game for the reasons I like a good TV show. The things I like about it have very little to do with it being a video game specifically. But as an experience in general, I enjoyed it. I think it's worth $30. So it gets a buy out of me, which is where I'm going to leave this particular review off. Hopefully you enjoyed all that. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.